The 1960s were a time of transition for Czechoslovakia and their animation industry as well. The communist nation was liberalizing in the post-Stalin era, leading to relaxed censorship of the film industry. This culminated in the 1968 Prague Spring, a period of political reform and mass protests. However, this led to a Soviet invasion and therefore a return of increased censorship. Also, like much of the world in the 1960s, Czechoslovakian animators were experimenting with modern and daring styles and techniques. By far the most popular and important Czech animator of the 1940s and 50s was Jiří Trnka, whose career continued into the 60s. He used many different methods, including cell and cutout animation, but he mainly focused on stop-motion animation using puppets he made himself. Trnka's 1962 short Passion warns the audience about the dangers of drunk or reckless driving by showing an impatient man from birth to his untimely death. The film forgoes the realism of a lot of Trnka's earlier work with highly stylized backgrounds and absurd touches like using chess pieces as fuel. Passion is mixed media like many of Trnka's films, and here he mixes the puppets with cutout animation and uses live action footage and photographs. Also from 1962, The Cybernetic Grandma was Trnka's first foray into sci-fi, with a bit of horror mixed in as well. The short is set in a surreal dystopia where machines have taken over many aspects of life. The title character is a frightening, mostly faceless robotic grandmother that wants to replace a little girl's flesh and blood peasant grandma. The robot says comforting things, but its behavior is controlling and abusive, and is literally a chair with doilies and a twisted imitation of a grandmother. The cybernetic grandma continued a common theme in Trnka's work by celebrating the natural world over artificiality. The countryside has been robbed of its natural beauty, and modernity has alienated humans from nature. There's also some unusual futuristic technology, like a record player that plays photographs and acts like a telephone, and even delivery drones. Fitting in with the subject matter, there's a warbly electronic soundtrack. A few years later, Trnka put out Archangel Gabriel and Mistress Goose, set in medieval Venice, and based on a story from the Decameron where a priest pretends to be the angel Gabriel in order to sleep with a woman. The short has a prologue with cutout animation before the main story told with puppets, where Trnka makes fun of the church and religious hypocrisy. Trnka's final film, and his most well-known outside of Czechoslovakia, was The Hand. The subversive 1965 short is a clear analogy for government control over an artist, and it's definitely Trnka's darkest. A sculptor is ordered by a disembodied hand to make likenesses of the hand, but he refuses and just wants to make pots for flowers. The hand is seemingly omnipotent, driving home the metaphor for authoritarianism. Also, at one point, the hand brings in a television and forces him to watch propaganda. The artist is eventually caged and forced to make the sculptures against his will. He's given medals, similar to how Trnka had just been named the national artist by the Czechoslovakian government, despite not being allowed to make an adaptation of Don Quixote years prior. Like with Passion, Trnka abandons any sense of realism here, as the Potter's house exists in a black void and space transforms impossibly. Like much of Trnka's work, it was entirely dialogue-free. The government banned the film after Trnka's death for 20 years, basically proving Trnka's point. Trnka was highly influential in Czechoslovakia and all across the world. I made a video all about Trnka if you'd like to learn more. As Trnka's career came to a close, another Czech legend of stop-motion was beginning his, and in the 60s we also see the first films from Jan Švankmajer. While both employed stop-motion, their approaches were quite different. Švankmajer's films were darker and more unsettling, and he was an avowed surrealist. He directed several short films in the 60s, often combining live action and stop-motion. A common theme in his early films was inanimate objects coming to life, and he incorporated lots of worn and dilapidated environments and objects. Some of his shorts of the 60s have no humans whatsoever, and they also sometimes lack narratives or dialogue. Švankmajer's films have a very distinct and recognizable look and feel. They are highly stylized and dense, with rapid editing and quick shots of unexpected close-ups. His shorts were also often rigorously structured, with an emphasis on cycles and repetition. His directorial career began in 1964 with The Last Trick, a mostly live-action short with a small amount of stop-motion. We see his work begin to develop into his signature method in his next film, Johann Sebastian Bach, Fantasy in G Minor. Dialogue-free and shot in black and white, it's sort of an abstract film in its focus on texture. A human character appears just in the beginning in live action to play the title piece on an organ. Stop motion is used to make cracks and holes in stone grow and shrink with no apparent explanation. The short features almost constant camera movement, with pans examining the rough, intricate surfaces of the walls. We get an early example of Švankmajer's formal experimentation, as at one point the camera starts juddering intensely in an unsettling way. There's basically no narrative at all, just an abstract exploration of surfaces. His next short, A Game with Stones, was also dialogue-free and lacks any human characters whatsoever. The short demonstrates Švankmajer's affinity for iterative, cyclical structures, as every time a clock strikes 12, stones come out of a faucet and fall into a bucket. They then move around in various patterns in front of solid black and white backgrounds, forming different shapes and figures. The shapes vary from abstract to resembling humans, and eventually the bucket breaks, ending the cycle. Švankmajer's trademark hyperactive editing is on display here as well. Švankmajer gets creepy in his 1966 short Punch and Judy, where two puppets fight over a guinea pig portrayed by a live animal. It starts off with uncanny monkeys playing instruments and includes quick cuts, multiple exposures, and zooms. The short is also mixed media, as it makes use of drawings and newspaper clippings. The items shown are rusted and worn down, showcasing Švankmajer's love of old used objects. Punch and Judy was mainly made with live puppetry, but does contain a bit of stop motion. The line between artifice and reality is blurred, as Švankmajer often did, by showing the audience the human hands entering and exiting the puppets. The live guinea pig is completely indifferent to the violence between the two puppets, fitting in with Švankmajer's common theme of a world that does not center around humans. His next short film, etc., is still dialogue-free as well as built around repetition, but it's different than his usual work in that it uses two-dimensional animation. Švankmajer's 1967 short titled Historia Natra is more similar to his signature mode, but still a bit unusual for him, as it's not just a combination of stop motion and live action, but also quickly edited shots of drawings. It's yet another one of his films that are built around repetition, and it's in 8 parts where the cycle repeats to show different types of animals, all divided by a close-up on a mouth eating a piece of meat. With his next work, The Flat, Švankmajer moves into the style he's become known for. The Kafkaesque short is entirely built around stop motion that makes household objects come to life and has no dialogue. Objects in a room all turn against a human and make life difficult for him. The film was eventually seized by the government and put away in a vault where no one could watch it. Then Švankmajer made the similarly themed Picnic with Weissman, where objects again move on their own with stop motion to the detriment of a human being. The objects still fulfill their intended purpose. The phonograph plays a record, a spade digs into the ground, and a chess set plays out a game. No people are seen until the macabre twist ending reveals that the hole being dug was actually a grave for the title character. A Quiet Week in the House was Švankmajer's third film in 2 years where objects come alive, and another cyclical one as it's structured around 7 days. The short has a voyeurism theme, and the plot centers around a man who watches the objects through holes in a wall. Interestingly, the stop-motion animation is silent and in color, while the live action has sounds and is shot in monochrome. There's also extensive use of multiple exposures, giving the film an even more surreal feel. It's Švankmajer's first use of animated meat, which became a common motif for him later in his career. Švankmajer finished off the decade with Don Juan, which has humans in puppet costumes that are part of an automated theater. It contrasts with his other shorts I've discussed, as it has extensive dialogue, a clear, straightforward narrative, isn't that surreal, and only has a bit of stop motion. A director with a much different but still quite singular style was Karel Zeman, who made 3 feature films in the 1960s that blended live action with animation. His whimsical aesthetic was strongly influenced by silent cinema, especially the film pioneer Georges Méliès, who shares Zeman's love for Jules Verne. Zeman usually tinted his films so that the frames were all a uniform color, a technique common in the early days of cinema. His films have a kind of steampunk vibe, decades before the term was even coined. Zeman was incredibly creative in his creation of special effects, and the synthesizing of various art forms is stunning and often seamless. He directed the 1961 film The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, which was adapted from an 18th century German novel. The look of the film takes inspiration from the engravings of the 19th century French illustrator Gustave Doré. It also uses a wide variety of techniques, like stop motion, collage, puppets, and painted backdrops. The movie is about space travel to the moon and includes references to Jules Verne and his 1865 novel From the Earth to the Moon. 17th century writer Cyrano de Bergerac is also a character, due to his early science fiction novel about an empire on the moon. Zeman's film is full of adventure with sword fights and chases, as well as bizarre imagery like the Baron riding a seahorse under the ocean. The film inspired director and Monty Python member Terry Gilliam, who made his own version of the novel in 1988. Zeman's next film, A Jester's Tale, is in a similar vein, but set during the 30 Years' War, which took place in the early 17th century. This gives Zeman the opportunity to satirize the military, politics, and religion as the 30 Years' War pitted Catholics against Protestants. His anti-war sentiments are clear, as the jester who introduces the film describes the conflict as the result of incompetent leadership, and the god of war is depicted as a buffoonish and capricious head in the sky blowing wind. Zeman's 1966 feature film The Stolen Airship is loosely based on two Jules Verne novels and tells the story of a group of young boys that hijack an airship, travel to an island, and eventually meet up with Verne's character Captain Nemo. It's in his usual style, but also inspired by the turn-of-the-century art movement Art Nouveau. Zeman's films were very influential around the world, inspiring not only Jan Švankmajer, but American directors like Tim Burton and Wes Anderson. Another important filmmaker with a unique process, and one that Zeman worked as an assistant for, was Hermína Týrlová, whose very long career lasted from the 20s to the 80s. Like Švankmajer, she used everyday objects and often dialogue-free stop motion, but in a much more whimsical and pleasant way. Týrlová used objects like toys and handkerchiefs, and soft fuzzy materials like wool and yarn. Her films were much more focused on children than those of Trnka and Švankmajer, but still formally experimental and inventive. She was critical of American animation for its reliance on violent slapstick, and her films were generally much more gentle. In her 1961 dialogue-free short The Curious Letter, stop motion is used to make a letter move on its own and blended with live action. Almost everything besides the letter is live action, and unlike the other films I'll mention from Týrlová, has human characters. Her playful short Two Balls of Wool is about exactly what you'd expect, and the title characters are anthropomorphized and play music while doing a little dance. Her short A Woolly Tale from 2 years later is along the same lines and features some interesting lighting and wind effects. She brought another simple everyday object to life in her surreal short Blue Apron, which has some frenetic editing and bizarre imagery. In The Snowman, Týrlová brings back the wool characters and even creates wool animals like dogs, birds, and penguins. Like Blue Apron and other Týrlová shorts, it is backed by an avant-garde electronic soundtrack. The short even won an award at the Venice Film Festival. Her short Christmas Tree again utilizes wool and centers around an anthropomorphic Christmas tree. In Coral Fairy Tale, Týrlová moves on to fish, who battle each other with pearls fired as projectiles. Star of Bethlehem is another award-winning short from Týrlová, this time telling the story of the birth of Jesus. Another important figure was Gene Deitch, who was actually an American that moved to Prague in 1960. Unlike the others mentioned so far, he worked solely in traditional animation, with no use of live action or stop motion. Deitch's 1961 short Monroe satirizes the military in a story about a 4-year-old who gets drafted and won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. Deitch also directed 13 shorts with the Hanna-Barbera characters Tom and Jerry, but they are highly controversial among Tom and Jerry fans. They seem to be mostly disliked, partly due to being much crueler than previous Tom and Jerry shorts. Tom constantly gets abused, sometimes by his sadistic owner Clint Clobber, who was an original Gene Deitch creation. The lack of quality may have been due to the fact that Deitch wasn't a fan of the characters and thought of the cartoons as just mindless violence. Deitch also worked on some Popeye shorts, but these are also generally considered to be of poor quality. Some higher quality cartoons are Deitch's Nudnik series of 12 dialogue-free shorts. The title character is a lovable loser whose life is a never-ending series of disasters. Deitch said this was a way of extending out the typical cartoon logic and physics. The first short was nominated for an Oscar, and the series even got a revival in the 1990s. Deitch was also the director of the unusual curiosity that is the 1967 12-minute adaptation of The Hobbit. This was actually the very first screen adaptation of anything Tolkien wrote, and was made hastily in order to hold on to the rights. Due to the haste, it has extremely limited animation, and is basically just a series of drawings with the camera movement creating motion. Obviously, major changes had to be made to fit the story into such a short running time, and there are no elves, Beorn, spiders, or Rivendell. It was only shown once to a tiny crowd, just to fulfill their legal requirements, and then hidden from the public for decades. It was thought to be a lost film, but then resurfaced in 2012. Also active in the 1960s was Bretislav Pojar, who had worked as an animator on many of Jiří Trnka's classic films of the 40s and 50s. The shorts Pojar directed in the 60s were often humorous and satirical, and he worked in both stop-motion and 2D animation. His 1961 short Billiards uses puppets and stop-motion, and the dialogue is visually represented with blocks of letters coming out of the characters' mouths. It also features a technique where the inner thoughts of characters are depicted by having imagery cover their faces, and Pojar would go on to use this multiple times. Pojar's next short, Orator, is similar in style to Billiards, with stop-motion puppets and the same depiction of dialogue. This one is a satire of the bourgeoisie, about a self-important public speaker who thinks he will captivate his audience. However, they all get bored, daydream, and eventually fall asleep. Yet they still clap when they wake up, and the speaker still feels like he accomplished something. To See or Not to See was the first of his films made with the National Film Board of Canada and uses 2D animation as opposed to puppets. The short illustrates souls as a sort of homunculus that controls the body like an automaton and has featureless backgrounds. In the satirical Darwin Anti-Darwin, an earthworm rapidly evolves and becomes a human, but decides to devolve back after being exposed to warfare, religion, and nationalism. Pojar was also a major creative force behind the very popular 11-part TV show Hey Mr. Let's Play. Running from 1965 to 1973, it's about two bear brothers portrayed by puppets. Another Trnka collaborator and founder of Czech animation was Jiří Brdečka. He co-directed Springman and the SS with Trnka in the mid-1940s, one of the very earliest surviving Czech cartoons. Brdečka directed multiple dialogue-free short films in the 60s, like the anti-conformity tale Incorrectly Drawn Hen. Set against basic minimal environments, a teacher scolds a child for making an unrealistic drawing, which then comes to life. A few years later, he made Let's Go Hunting in the Woods in a much different look and tone. Brdečka adapts a folk song about a hunter who accidentally kills his beloved in a way more serious short than Incorrectly Drawn Hen. Brdečka's short film Vengeance has sort of a horror feel and is presented in an unusual style with a muted color palette that is almost monochrome in parts. In the surreal Metamorpheus, he tells the story of Orpheus and Eurydice in a mixed-media short that incorporates live-action footage. František Vystrčil debuted in the late 50s and continued with 2D animated shorts such as Cosmodrome 1999, a humorous science fiction story with gibberish instead of dialogue. Director Josef Kábrt made traditionally animated shorts throughout the 60s, often visually minimalist and ranging from the humorous history of marriage to the dark and surreal whims of love. While the vast majority of animation came from the Czech side of the country during the 1960s, Slovakian animation was getting its start during the decade. The first big name was Viktor Kubal, who is often called the father of Slovakian animation. His 1966 short Earth depicts a peasant dealing with urbanization in a flat style with minimalist backgrounds. Kubal's comedic short film Dita at the Front is about a little girl in the middle of a battle and is full of absurd rapid-fire gags. Dita manages to end the conflict with silly tricks, like using a magnet to collect all the cannonballs being fired. Also getting her start in the 60s was Slovakian director Jaroslava Havatová. In 1969, she made the colorful and surreal music video titled simply Song, which took inspiration from pop art and psychedelia. There were also some animated TV shows for children airing during the decade in Czechoslovakia, mostly in black and white. One popular series that was in color was Robber Room Zeiss, which debuted in 1967 and ran until 1984. The show was about a cobbler who gets banished after insulting the mayor and ends up a Robin Hood-like robber. Other examples include The Tales of Moss and Fern, about forest people and using minimalist traditional animation, and Beetles, a puppet stop-motion show that began airing in 1967. A popular Slovakian series was Poof a Moof, which starred cats, was based on a children's book, and directed by Viktor Kubal. Clearly, there was a wide variety of animation from Czechoslovakia in the 1960s by several talented and influential filmmakers. Many of these films are available to watch for free on either YouTube or archive.org. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.